So looking at the violence that we have seen here on our streets over the last couple of weeks, this is not my first rodeo. We saw the very same faces and their ideological heirs in the 1960s when the radical left stepped out and moved from class warfare to promote their Marxist ideas into racist warfare and did the very same thing they're doing today. Students for a Democratic Society, Weather Underground, Black Panthers, I could go on, faces like Angela Davis, black, Bill Ayers, white. Those two are still active today. They've been college professors. What was their promotion? Hardcore Marxism. Race was only the vehicle they were using to promote it, and they knew it and pretty much said so. It was this radical Marxist takeover of the civil rights movement that hijacked it for over 50 or 60 years. And remember, back in the 60s, they used to call the police pigs. They used to call the police helicopters whirly pigs. Did you ever read the Berkeley Barb? I did. I was there in the Bay Area when all of this was going down. This is not my first rodeo. Terry Turchie is former assistant director of the Counter-terrorism division of the FBI from 1994 to 1998. He directed the Unabomber Federal Task Force, his career at the FBI spanning 30 years, and in January of this year, co-authored a book entitled, in their own words, The Democratic Party's Push for a Communist America. More and more, the Democratic platform, it's radicalizing like Professor Kessler had predicted, looking much more like the Communist Manifesto.
When we look at the Weather Underground, I was back in New York, in the FBI, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, served in all those places and worked counterintelligence involving the former Soviet Union, and then moved to terrorism. And along the way, learned a great deal about all these groups and started getting into all the things they had written in the manifesto called Prairie Fire, which the Weather Underground wrote in 1974. And what prompted our book, in their own words, The Democratic Party's Push Towards a Communist America. When you look at Prairie Fire, which is 180 pages, it was one of the last things the Weather Underground put out before they started running in a lot of directions because the FBI was shutting them down finally, is a strategy to essentially continue the revolution, to live to fight another day. And they said, we'll continue on for the next decade and we'll influence the educational system. We'll go where we can really hurt them in their own institutions. And eventually from inside those institutions, we'll come back. And this is the strategy we'll use. And they laid that strategy out. Today, even though the Weather Underground had thousands of people out committing bombings and hundreds of thousands they could depend upon to come out and protest, provide them the cover they needed to make it look like their issues were the issues of the day that everybody supported, today there are smaller groups of people. But what has happened is the self-described Weather Underground communist-minded men and women have essentially transferred their ideology of communism into the Democratic Party. And the strategy that they set forth back in 1974 in Prairie Fire is the exact strategy that is being played out today. There's about 6 points that are critical to that and that we look at in this book.
Yeah, two things seem to happen with the group. You see that pattern, by the way. If you notice, Antifa is horizontally organized so that if one part of it gets chopped off, the rest of it keeps on going. The second thing that happens, if you notice, there's always a breakup in these groups. These groups fight with each other internally, and Marxist revolutions devour their own sooner or later. But go ahead, let's pick the 6 points. I want to hear them.
Sure, and before I do that even, I just would like to piggyback on something you just said about the breakups. The Weather Underground emerged from a breakup with the Students for a Democratic Society way back in the 70s, and they wanted to pursue the violent part of the revolution in the streets of America, where the SDS thought they were going to be more benefited by quietly and stealthily pursuing the political part. So today, if you draw a line from the SDS philosophical belief, you can draw it right into the Democratic Socialists of America. The Weather Underground, you can now draw into the rest of the Democratic Party. And these 6 points. The first one is capitalism. Capitalism to those folks was the enemy, and it had to be destroyed. So today, of course, when you hear AOC, who's a Democratic representative in our own United States Congress, say that capitalism is irredeemable and that capitalism doesn't work and we have to move away from capitalism, and you hear more and more Democrats saying similar things, then you know that the Democratic Party's platform and ideology now is lining up and is identical with exactly what the Weather Underground said. So capitalism is the first. They want to get rid of capitalism. They want to get rid of what provides people with the ability to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The second thing they want to do, they want to attack the Bill of Rights. The big thing with communism, of course, whether it's the Weather Underground or the Black Panther Party, they want to, in our culture, dethrone, I use the word dethrone God. God gets in the way of Gov, right? It's not going to be in God we trust. It's going to be in Gov we trust. And the bigger and more powerful the government is, the better for these people. And communism has no interest in having to compete with God. I think one of the things that really bothered me about the weekend and about the latest trend coming out of this is this whole thing of kneeling. People need to understand the symbolic nature of that and how that photograph is being taken out, how all these photographs of all these celebrities and sports stars and all these other people, that shot with Nancy Pelosi and her staff. The idea that you kneel, that's submission. And I was always taught, and I've actually heard it now in a couple forums where people are talking back, you're taught to kneel before God, not to kneel before government authority and not to kneel before somebody else who's telling you, kneel and do this before you can get up. Well, that's reminiscent of every major awful event of the past when the kings cut off somebody's head after they've knelt and given all their apologies in the hopes they can save their lives. But, of course, they're the first to get their head cut off. So that's a really bad trend, and I hope that somebody sees the light here. You cannot negotiate with terrorists, and you cannot submit to this kind of nonsense, because if we do this, and say we have what I think is a living nightmare, say Joe Biden gets in the White House, and say they sweep the House and the Senate, these same politicians now are going to be on the fast track to taking away the kinds of things the police need to quell these riots, taking away the ability of the police to act independently with the kinds of tactics that will work, and they will literally watch the next time our cities burn, and they will have no way to stop it, and this will get so out of control, and this whole thing will tumble into what a colleague of mine says, the abyss. Because as they attack the Bill of Rights, as they attack God, they're really attacking the rule of law, because our laws really come from the Judeo-Christian type philosophy, so that's so dangerous.
You know, Terry, two things in line with what you were just saying did come to mind this week. The first thing was the no-go zone that the protesters created in Seattle, covered about 6 city blocks, get rid of the police, and we're going to make this an ungovernable area, which, by the way, is the goal of change agents, community organizers, is to challenge the existing structure by destabilizing it. This just comes right out of the Alinsky playbook. But the second thing was the same faces that are telling you we want to abolish the police are the very same political and activist faces that oppose people having weapons to defend themselves. So when we pitch over into the abyss because we no longer have a police force to help us govern ourselves, what will then defend us? Or let's suppose they're right. All of the police agencies around the country are abusive. Well, how do we defend ourselves from that? See, this is all that clanging, banging, self-contradiction and internal opposition and everything they're spouting that we see because of this amalgam of Gramscian Marxism, Frankfurt School, postmodernism, and socialism. It's all wrapped in one big bailiwick, and it just goes from issue to issue, riding along on top of those issues, relying on the fact that there are true believers, meaning people who think that the issue is really all about police brutality or all about racism. It's not. And we know that going all the way back to the 1960s. We'll be back. We're at steelonsteel.com. I'm John Leffler. The program is Steel on Steel. What you're looking at today in the country is not just all of this neo-Marxist activity, this amalgam I talked about. You're also looking at 50 years of historic revisionism that has gone on inside of academia, to the point that today's millennials have a very distorted, lopsided view of what the country is all about. Many of them are getting depressed because they're being told that their parents are racist and they don't seem to be as concerned as the young people are. Those are the true believers that are marching down the street, and they think it's all about protesting racism. They have not a clue of what is going on underneath. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Leffler here with you. But also, as far as devouring your own, I didn't know if you noticed this, Mayor Lori Lightfoot of Chicago and Admiral Raymond Lopez, one of her harshest critics there, engaged in a very angry and foul-mouthed argument over the city's handling of its widespread violence during a conference call with 50 of the aldermen back at the end of May to discuss the city's response to shooting. The second time, remember I say they always devour their own? The other time is the civil war going on at the New York Times over which view is going to prevail, traditional liberalism or the new radical neo-Marxism. This is that internal nest sign fighting that goes on all the time in this type of a revolution, same as the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks or the Jacobins in the French Revolution. Terry Turchie's joining me right now. Did I say welcome back? Well, you're here. I'm here, so let's skip it. Former Deputy Assistant Director of the Counter-terrorism Division of the FBI from 1994 to 1998. Co-author of, in their own words, the Democratic Party's push for a communist agenda. The same voices telling us we shouldn't allow citizens to be armed are the very same ones telling us that they want to abolish the police department. The only thing that's going to result from that is either dictatorship and an armed army or Gestapo that's going to contain the violence that erupts after that, or we're going to descend into vigilantism. You know, they're right out in the open about it now. You have to listen to the extreme things they are pushing for.
You're absolutely right, John. That's exactly where they want to go. It's actually there's an entire section of the 2016 Democratic Party platform. In this particular part, they talk about all of the police reform. Joe Biden has a huge section on his website, which is his plan to, quote, reform the police. And of course, we laugh about his idea that part of the police reform is, shoot him in the leg. Well, there's a lot more that he doesn't know as well. And so his package gets very, very touchy and just really goes off the rails. So we'll go back then to the systemic racism part. The real philosophy behind that, the reason that they're so into this topic is that's their chief weapon. That was the chief weapon of the Weather Underground. And remember, 50 years ago, they were using that to try to overthrow the government then. And they left that as their main tactic in the Weather Underground's Prairie Fire. And now here we have it again, showing up, literally integrated into the Democratic Party's heart. The whole purpose of that is truly one thing, to sever the trust and the bond that local communities have with their police. And then to step in, we'll come to the rescue and we'll reform and we'll work with the police to change how they do things. Well, what they're really saying when you read all the fine line and the fine print, and I'm sure we'll see this in their police package they want to put before Congress here, what they really want to do is they want to take away the independence of the police. And they want politicians to control the decisions and the actions of the police. Well, politicians plus controlling the actions of the police equals authoritarianism. We know that. Equals a police state. And that's exactly where they're going. They want to intimidate and control the police. I'll deviate one little bit here. On the other side of town in Washington, D.C., what has been buried in the news, because they don't want to get into this since it's all unraveling for them, is that we've already seen how this works. Bob Mueller spent 12 years, a number of those as the FBI director under Barack Obama. And Bob Mueller replaced fidelity, bravery, and integrity with diversity, equality, and social justice. And we saw what happened to the FBI when it took on a couple of cases that should have been relatively simple. The Hillary Clinton email case, and then, of course, the Russian Trump invention, which they called an investigation. The FBI literally collapsed. It lied. It did a miserable job with those. Right now, many FBI agents who were in the FBI feel like I do. You can't trust it. And another FBI agent said this. He said, Terry, I have to tell you why I'm so worried. We knew the real FBI. We knew the FBI before Bob Mueller and before James Comey. And we both know, given what we learned in the field and learned in the street and learned about the enemies to America, that if the FBI collapses, America will not be far behind. And that should scare every single American citizen, because that's where we're headed. So I get back to the last three. I'll talk about international solidarity. International solidarity, you see all these demonstrations that look like they're spontaneous, that are springing up over the world in support of Black Lives Matter, in support of all of these issues. And in effect, they're not spontaneous. There is a constant standing, organized effort to bring all kinds of groups to the table and to the streets when something like this happens. And part of the key, the underlayment essentially of communism, is international solidarity. It is a globalist movement. It's not today connected, for example. People think of the former Soviet Union or Russia or whatever. This is not so much connected, although I'm sure they take advantage of it, to these other countries like Iran, China, and Russia. But it is independent movement based more on the idea of communism and socialism in their purity as ways to run countries. So this is extremely dangerous because people think, gee, all over the world, America is losing credibility. No, America is experiencing what communists are good at, which is organizing mobs of people. And that's all this is about. Two final things to the organization and management of these. The Weather Underground outlined the categories of people that had to be identified and then organized into masses to literally go to the street. And in the Prairie Fire Manifesto, they even say, we will own the urban centers of America. And like Che Guevara has told us, we will create not one Vietnam or two or three or four. We'll create many Vietnams in the cities of America, and the empire will finally crack. That is literally what they thought. So you look at the organization part, and of course, who did we have elected for years as president? We had the community organizer himself. And so this category of people in the Weather Underground Manifesto is described in many places. But essentially, it's back then in the 70s, it was Chicanos, blacks, Native Americans, women, and Asian Pacific Islander types. So it went like that. And then they had these phrases throughout the manifesto. You read the 2016 Democratic Party platform, they haven't even hardly changed the order. They've only changed a couple things, like we no longer use Chicanos, we use Hispanics, right? So all that's changed, but everything else remains the same. So we can really argue that the strategy that the Weather Underground thought would be successful as both a political and a revolution having both a political and violent side could be or was transferred into the heart of the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party platform. They call their 2016 platform the most progressive ever. It'll be fascinating when the 2020 one comes out to see exactly what they have to say. But so this is why we wrote this book, and we go through it, and we then go the next route and compare the Democratic Party platform, Prairie Fire, the Communist Party of the USA website and platform, the Democratic Socialists of America. We get into a little bit about potential for funding, where this money is moving around. And then we get into a lot about linguistics and language and personalities, the actual representatives in the Democratic Party who clearly understand and adopted this and are probably some of the main figures in pulling this off. Because the real problem with today is that we now have just one American-type political party that's loyal to the Constitution and the oath of office. We have another one which reminds us constantly, we're about reconstruction, we're about reimagining, we're about the fundamental transformation of the United States of America. And that is absolutely frightening.
You know, you were talking about the FBI. I guess the reason I find this more troubling, there are two concerns, and we can probably unpack both of them here. Number one, the inability of the FBI seemingly to prevent certain forms of terrorism, and that would be the nexus between radical leftists, radical Islamist terrorists, anti-Israel groups, pro-Palestinian radical groups, this nexus that seems to exist with them, along with, I think there's something like 20 different Marxist organizations in the country. And the second one is the concern because of the abuse of the FBI. I mean, you had, like you said, people lying to the FISA court. But if they employ it, then they can begin using the force of law against people who are not politically correct, who are dissenting from this. And you and I both know there's enough laws around here to indict a ham sandwich if you had to.
Sure. Well, let's take that first. Let's take the rule of law aspect. The FBI knew how to work these two investigations that I mentioned before were relatively simple. The mid-year exam, which was the Clinton email, and the Crossfire Hurricane, which was the Russian Trump investigation. All through those investigations, and back in 2018, I mentioned this in an interview, I said, this doesn't look to me like the Russians have come across the door of the FBI. This looks to me like the Democratic Party has come in the door of the FBI. Something wrong here. Well, now what we know, and there is no question in my mind, and John, I worked counterintelligence for almost half my 30-year career. I worked counterterrorism for the other half. And I'll tell you that there is no doubt in my mind, there is no doubt in the minds of seasoned FBI agents who knew what they were doing, that this was a political party engaged in massive dirty tricks in both of these investigations and got by with it, essentially. So now we already had, before we went into the crisis we're in, we had this double standard. But the real problem with what the FBI was involved in is they were a partner, in my opinion, in trying to throw out, essentially, the President of the United States by making it look as if the man had serious connections with the Russians. Now, everybody really should have known from day one, since when has the Democratic Party seemed to care about national security and the Russians anyway? But that aside, they used all that they'd learned over many, many years of sometimes being in the White House, sometimes being in the majority. They know the road to follow. They know the playbook. So they understand in the intelligence community where they can go to turn all this information and all the things we've always known about the Russians into something that they could neutralize President Trump. And by golly, they have used that as the cornerstone of, quote, the resistance. And by the way, Weather Underground's strategy, what they named it back in 1974 to overthrow the government, they called it the resistance. So this is not really very hard to follow these days. They're more and more out in the open. And the FBI became part of that. And we're all just kind of shaking our head. Now, what we already believed over the last 3 years is now really becoming filled in kind of by the facts. We can see as all these documents finally got out, mostly because of Mr. Grinnell, we can see that we weren't that far off. What is really frightening about it is that it's all pointing and marching right back to the White House, right back to the Oval Office in that January 5th meeting in 2017 involving Barack Obama and James Comey and the acting Attorney General at the time, Sally Yates. That is a fascinating glimpse at what was really going on. And I wish we had video of that. I wish we could have seen the batting eyes and the winks and nods, because that's exactly what happened. And then the next day, Comey goes up and dutifully briefs Trump on the things he can talk to him about, knowing that literally he's part and parcel of an effort that is going to try and get Trump out of office based around this Russian Trump thing. And our country has been disrupted ever since. It's amazing Donald Trump has been able to do as much as he has in office based on what he's had to face. It's just incredible to me that he can weather this and still be a fighter. And the problem for all of us is whether you like him or you don't like him, whether you like his gruffness or whatever, this is the guy that essentially, the way I look at it, was chosen to come along at this time. This is a personality we need to lead people against these others who are really trying to scare the daylights out of everyone. Now, the coup failed, right? So what do we have now? Well, now we got the violence in the streets. We've got the so-called peaceful protesters, and then we've got the actual rioters and the Antifa types and these other elements, BLM. Some are quiet, some aren't so quiet. But bottom line is, all of them are really unified by their belief in communism, by their belief in the ideology of socialism, which, by the way, never happened. There isn't any example of socialism that you can point to. Everything just basically collapses, and then along comes the authoritarian figure. That's what this is about, and it's not going to be any different here.
And, you know, you're right about one thing. You can see this language just ported right over. The language is identical from the Maoist organizations to what's incorporated into the party. And it's also in danger of breaking up because there are dissenters walking away from the party at the same time. There's stress within it. And of course, you know what happens then. Anybody who walks off the reservation gets attacked rather viciously, is in the name of tolerance and diversity, by the way. Any closing thoughts, Terry? And where the book is, I'm assuming it's available at Amazon and Kindle and places like that.
Yes, the book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And I guess the closing thought, John, is just that there are so many people like yourself, shows out there, people trying to get the truth out. And I just hope people can get out and listen to those who are really trying to tell them and warn them that the lights are blinking, just like they were before 9/11. And we can see it all. It's very clear. And it's not just a matter of making an analysis or giving an opinion. We wrote this book so that people could make their own decision after reading what these politicians are saying, have said, and then are doing. And it's essentially all in their own words. And it compares right up against the Weather Underground, the Communist Party of the United States, and generally the ideology of communism.
Any blogs or websites?
Yes. I'm on Twitter at Turchie. We have History Publishing Company's website, which is, I don't know it exactly, but History Publishing Company, LLC. They can go on and put that in Google and they'll see the website. We also will be doing a lot more in the coming days on Instagram and Twitter as well. So there's quite a bit out there, and there'll be a lot more as the days go by.
All right, Terry Turchie, appreciate it. Once again, the book, in their own words, The Democratic Party's Push for a Communist America. Don't forget to click the links in the description for more information on today's guest. If you like this interview, you can hear the rest of it by going to our steelonsteel.com website and listening with your subscription. Try us out free. There's a no-strings-attached offer for a 1-month trial.